I got introduced to Pathways when I took over as an independent living program manager for Denver County in 2018. Actually, the first week I started with the Pathways retreat, so it was kind of a cool way to get immersed in the culture, if you will. I think that it aligns with my own values, so it's not really difficult to kind of embrace the model for you know, supportive services, front loading, getting kids set up, in front loading with resources and connected. I don't think that it was an issue transitioning to the model. I do think that, being able to work with young people, smaller caseloads, more intensively, one-on-one, is always going to be better outcomes with that. I do think that Pathways has a lot of the best pieces that we love in Chiefy work, and just really child welfare and engaging youth. That engagement piece is super important and to the core of like who I am, and engagement. I'm very passionate about that. That youth voice piece, certainly. And so I think it just really kind of lined up and aligned quite nicely. It also kind of gave a little more structure, and momentum behind the work that we're doing, just to be able to get funding, and additional things to do with youth. I think like the flex funds, of course, that's awesome to just be able to have lunch with young people and then just engage them in a way that, like, who doesn't want to talk over food, or, even when they're hungry, or being able to help them with their phone bill and other things that sometimes we're not able to or limited to do with other funds that we were able to do with those funds. I like the information gathering, and just even though the baseline surveys and even the screening process, I think that it had some challenges trying to kind of smooth it out and make the pivot. I think that I've done my best to kind of integrate the best of both worlds, and kind of take some of the process stuff and behind the scenes stuff that we have to do, that's like paperwork, off, and really just getting to the meat of the why behind the what we're doing and those things, and connecting youth, and so trying to smooth that out as best as possible. And so that's just, I guess, how I came to
At the beginning. So I've been involved since day one. I come in from the runaway and homeless youth provider, so I was one of the RIDE providers. And there were a couple things that I think were really important. First thing that was, I think, the big aha, or the big important challenge, was this place where we understood that runaway and homeless youth providers were aiming at the same thing that child welfare workers were doing, but we hadn't been in a room and talked about it a lot. And I think that I'll start is like, there was a big aha. We're sharing young people. Young people are in the shelters. Young people in our shelters, have aged out of foster care and become homeless. We also started looking at data and found that there's a higher percent of homeless youth in our shelters. And I think the aha was, and the first step was really important from the Pathways for its success, is getting these two partners aligned and on the same table, so that we're saying we're both working for the same thing, and how do we start a common language? So I think the one really super important thing is, what's our common language? How do we describe young people? The next thing is my role was also a little bit different. Neither of the navigators I work with were actually social workers. They did not have their MSWs. They came in both with some experience or some lived experience. One came from working in a homeless shelter. Another one grew up in Colorado's foster care system. And so I think the important thing about the model was, we took a lot of time talking and listening to those doing the work, which oftentimes we don't do. We don't take a lot of time listening to that. And I think the couple things that I would say I would highlight as being really important is my intervention and my time with both of those navigators I worked with were not called supervision, they were called coaching. So we actually used it, we did coaching. I'm a coach by trade. And so it was a coaching model, not only for them, but it helped them feel like coaching. And they were kind of saying, oh, this is different. Like, we're on the same side of a situation. We're looking towards a unified principle. And so I would say the model clicking in was, not different from what I believed was good for young people and for my workers. But what was different is we started to have this real big conversation about your role as a navigator is just to hold the flashlight. What's over here? What are we looking at? How are you going to get there? How can I help you? And those skills change. And from a young person perspective, hearing a young person come up and say, this is what's going on in my life, and this is what I think can help, and this is what I need from you, was a very different conversation than a young person calling up and saying, this is what's going on in my life. I need you to fix it. And that was one of the things that I think the voice of the young people saying, we're working on this together and I know you're my partner. So that's one part.
Into Pathways. And so I had previously been working side by side with the supervisor of Pathways prior to that, and we worked as a team. So we co-supervised a team, and the team for Pathways was one navigator, and then we had 4 Chafee/TAY workers. So in Boulder we have transition age youth programming as well as Chafee and Pathways. And the TAY program had worked with the RIDE provider in our area, which is Together. So it was always a group that made sense to work together. So when the other supervisor left Boulder County, Pathways came under the umbrella of our independent living services and programming. So it was an easy shift for me, but having that big chunk of training to really take it all in and understand the differences between Pathways and the traditional Chafee and how we provided services to the transition age youth from RIDE provider and the shelter services in Boulder made it a richer, more complete package. And so looking at things from the Pathways perspective and engaging youth in a coach-like way really started to kind of trickle out into all of the casework that we did. And so when we changed over where all of our caseworkers in the independent living programs became navigators trained in the engagement model, it was really an easy shift. Not to say that there weren't kind of bumps along the way, but for me, the shift was easy. And so to lead the team in that, it was something that I believed in. And so I think that even though there were the bumps for navigators to really fully embrace it after I had, at least it was the model I believed in.
Seeing the success, like the model like really is in place for you to walk alongside that young person and to be a support for them, but to also teach them, how to become independent and find their independence by providing those tools and resources, and by just really making sure that everything that you're doing is driven by that youth and that young person so that they can reach their goals. So you're providing the resources, but then that youth is being able to follow through on things, and you can see those real-time accomplishments and achievements because you have specific focus. You have the 5 pathways, so you can really help support that youth in like reaching their educational and employment goals and any goals that they have working on. The biggest goal for me and the population that I was serving when youth were coming out of the system and experiencing homelessness, the biggest goal that they had was housing and being able to find housing stability. And with that, you have to have financial stability as well. And so it was really cool to see some of the success stories from the youth, when they were, because the approach of the Pathways model really provided that wraparound support that they needed
for this to move forward. The other thing that I'm really intrigued about, just because of the type of navigators I sponsored, is this very important concept between what's the difference between eligibility, which is we look at credentialing, we look at social work, we look at all these things as being so core to helping move forward, and this thing about suitability. And that's where lived experience comes in. That's where empowering young people's voice and also empowering the way that we use our vulnerable side, what has brought us to doing our work a little bit differently. And I do think that that's somewhat the magic of Pathways, because that's coaching, right? When I show up as a coach, I show up, but I don't leave who I am at the door. I align with that person. I bring my whole self in, and I look at my awareness of how this is, that 360 view listening that we talk about in coaching. And I think that that is probably one of the most critical skills we have to build. But it also puts us in a very important place of helping everyone who's navigating being a human attached to a young person who's looking at how do we work together for us to be allies in what you want for your life. Not anything more, but what you want for your life.
Just how the practice itself is so much more around what a youth needs and what a youth wants. And so often that was a struggle in the past with just the traditional Chafee model and having caseworkers give us their treatment plan around what a youth was supposed to work on, and knowing that a youth had never given any input into that. And so with Pathways, starting over and picking the youth's top 2 or 3 goals and working on those and really supporting the youth on how to get to a goal completion, not necessarily doing the tasks for him or her, I think is the big powerful piece for Pathways. You meet with someone more frequently, you get to know what they want, and if there's a stumbling block, it's just kind of observing it and talking about why that happened or what the stall was, making sure that the goal is still what they want to achieve and working towards that. I think another big aha shift for me was a practice shift. Again, we had time to really make the movement in this practice shift, but having the smaller caseloads was something I worried about. How will we serve people? How will we not have a huge wait list? But working with youth, and then on my part, working with the navigator about when someone's really ready to launch and graduate from the program. It's in the past, workers with Chafee youth would have someone stay on their caseloads for years and years, and I think a lot of that was because there isn't anyone else that the youth works with, and so there's a fear that if there's not someone there to support the youth, they will have no one. And sometimes that is the case, but with Pathways, the goal is to find permanent connections that are not us, that are not paid people. It's a neighbor, it's a coworker, it's somebody else that's there because they've made a true connection. And so it's not just finding housing, but it's finding a permanent connection and knowing how to advocate for themselves to get their needs met. And then knowing that we are still around, should they need to call in for more resources or just information about programs in the area, whatever that might be. We don't disappear. But the connection with the smaller caseloads is recognizing that a youth has achieved the goals that we initially set out, and that we don't necessarily have to keep them open to our program because of fears that they're not ready. A big part of independent living and Pathways is maybe we're never ready, but we have to try and do our best, and then we still have something to fall back on if we need to. So those were some aha moments and practice shifts in Boulder.
And when you're looking at the Pathways model, they have the 5 pathways, and those 5 pathways are really there to help that youth find that stability. So education, employment, housing, connections, and then their health and well-being. So it's just really centered around just them as just who they are. It's just so centered around them, and they get to determine their goals and what they want to do, and then we're there kind of like an accountability partner, just to help them, hey, checking in, seeing where they're at, and then it's just really exciting to be a part of those graduations, to see them successfully exit the program and follow their dreams or their goals. It's really amazing.
And I remember back in the beginning, we had this big wheel and we had all the tools. It's like, oh, we do this and we provide this and we give this and we do that. And the first model, if people go back to look at the first design of what this intervention was, it was a whole lot of stuff. And coaching was one of those things we could do. And it was almost like a caseworker or a navigator was sitting in the middle of this wheel of all these things and saying, I'm going to bring this in, I'm going to bring this in, I'm going to bring this in, I'm going to bring this in. What we did is we kept the wheel there. We put coaching in the middle, and all of a sudden the navigator's looking and saying, I have these things. What is important to you? How do we put it together? And then they aligned on what they chose. They aligned on what they picked. And I think that that is key in pivoting differently, is because when you're in a system where, and it is the nature of the system, right? You go to court and you're told what's going to happen. You get this thing, all of a sudden you have somebody say, okay, tell me what you think. It takes a minute for you to feel it like you can say what you think. Exactly. But all of a sudden that changes that concept of stigma, right? It changes this thing of that was then and up until now thinking, which is like where coaching becomes magic. So I think that's the other magic of the pathway model is we stop looking at the tools we had as the solution, and we started looking at the young person and said the solution is inside you. And that's where pathways changed.